Welcome to Sacred Cow Shipyards, where no ship is safe from being slaughtered like a cow. You Humies are fundamentally fascinating to me. In some regards at least, but my point is, a few episodes ago I announced that Sacred Cow Shipyards is now accepting sponsorships, and no, it's not accepting sponsorships from that weird the Raid Shadow whatever the heck game or the Simpla security company or everything else you've seen on the YouTubes, but no, I will only accept sponsorships from fans. Friends perhaps, but mostly just fans. People who actually watch this channel and have something they want to advertise. We can work that out. Let me know at dockmaster@sacredcowshipyards.com if you want to work that out. But you, my fans, are the only people I will work with, because I am not interested in dealing with large monolithic entities. We have enough monoliths laying around the shipyard as it is, and they're all cranky. But the reason I'm actually saying that you Humies amaze me is I made that announcement, and then the next episode was sponsored, and the episode after that is sponsored, and this very episode is sponsored. Y'all make such amazing things that you're willing to toss currency my way to talk about the amazing things you do. It's cool. I am actually so very glad that so many of you are doing such awesome things with your lives. That is notable and should be celebrated. And, honestly, should be advertised. After all, we're mercenary and corporate and commercial and all the rest of that nonsense. So with that in mind, I would like to note that this week's episode is sponsored by Tanager's Fledglings, a novel written by Cedar Sanderson. And I just have a few questions for you. Do you like science fiction books? Do you like tramp freighters? Do you like second chances? Do you like basset hounds? I'm not even sure what that is, but let's go with that. Do you like authors that have such interesting backgrounds as to have a degree in forensic sciences and then decide they want to write science fiction stories in the end? Well, if you like that kind of variety, and after all, variety is the spice of life, this book is right up your alley. Personally, I note that the reviewers actually compare the author to Andre Norton, whose name should mean something to you, and I also appreciate that the book is available in hard copy format as well as Kindle. And we all know that hard copies are awesome, so, go buy books. How can you go wrong? And speaking of going wrong, the idea was proposed in an earlier video that I am not, in fact, the Dockmaster. Instead, I may be Vir Koto, overseeing the slow, ponderous decline of the Alpha Centauri Society, and whiling away the time watching old renditions of what Humies thought their future would look like. And then somehow, temporally transporting these videos back into the past and posting them on YouTube for y'all to enjoy. Well, I love that story, and in fact, Emperor Koto is a good friend of mine, and actually a fairly decent sophont as you squishies go. That is sadly not the case. If that were the case, I would end every single episode by smiling and waving, just like this. But since I don't, I'm not him. Sorry to disappoint. And speaking of disappointments, although this is the worst segue ever, I will grant, let's talk about the concept of warp nacelles in the Star Trek universe. Or more generally, nacelles, and you'll understand why I expanded the concept in just a second. Because nacelles in Star Trek have been called warp nacelles, warp field nacelles, power nacelles, energy nacelles, antimatter nacelles, warp drive pods, and space warp propulsion units. Also, The nacelles on some shuttlecraft, specifically the Type 15 shuttle pod, have absolutely nothing to do with warp because the shuttle pod isn't actually warp capable. Those nacelles actually just house the impulse drives. But they still put them in nacelles because everything in Star Trek has to have a nacelle. And technically there's a reason for that. The nacelles were originally installed on Starfleet vessels because the designers, and by that I mean the people who actually made the original ships for original series and Next Generation and so on and so forth, the actual art department, the art director himself, actually a certain gentleman by the name of Walter M. Jeffries, believed that the faster-than-light engines would be redonkulously powerful and therefore potentially dangerous. And so for crew safety, they would be housed separately away from the inhabited sections of the ship in case something went wrong. He also thought that would make it easier to upgrade the engines on the ship, and that was actually the case, as you saw with the post-refit Enterprise in the Star Trek The Motion Picture movie, because it did not have the same nacelles as it did in the original series. They were upgraded, had a better engine. So yeah, modularity kind of won out there. Likewise, in the official Star Trek Blueprints document, the Constitution-class nacelles produce ridiculously dangerous levels of radiation while they're active at warp speeds, to the point where the crew is not actually allowed to be in them. And yes, the nacelles actually had small control rooms built into them for maintenance and on-scene measurement of whatever the heck's going on in the nacelle. But yes, when the warp drive was engaged, not a good place for a squishy to be. Now, amusingly, this notion got both lampshaded and subverted in the Enterprise prequel series, because on the NX-01 ship, the actual warp nacelles themselves were so sufficiently shielded that they were basically the shelters for the crew when they encountered some sort of, interstellar energy storm of sufficient levels that the standard ship's hull was not able to withstand it. They were so heavily shielded that was a safe place to be. Now, obviously, the ship wasn't actually at warp while this was happening, but it does illustrate that, yes, whatever's going on in the nacelles, and that's a whole separate conversation, is highly energetic and not something you want to be in close proximity to. That's why, after all, most nacelles are heavily separated from the ships they are attached to, at least in the Federation. And even saying that, yes, I know there are exceptions. Notably the Defiant and the Steamrunner classes. Now, the Defiant class by itself is an exception on its own. I don't know what's going on with the Steamrunner, but we're just going to ignore those for the time being. Alright, so why am I jabbering on and on about warp nacelles? Because today, in fact, we are going to talk about the California class from Star Trek. Now, yes, some of you may not know what the California class is. That may be because you have not yet seen the animated show called Lower Decks. Now, bear with me for just a second, because yes, I agree with probably most of my audience's sentiment that what Paramount has been doing to Star Trek is a goddamned travesty. Picard, that is to say the series called Picard, makes me sad every time the name comes up. Thankfully, since I exist in a parallel pocket sideways alternate dimension, I am very safe in saying that a series by the name of Discovery has never happened here, and I'm going to do my best to ensure that keeps not happening. But, that said, Strange New Worlds is a surprisingly, almost shockingly good rendition of original Trek. It's fascinating, especially since so many of the writers overlap between it and that Discovery thing. And in a similar vein, Lower Decks provides a perspective on Starfleet that was sorely lacking in every previous show in the Star Trek universe. Yes, Deep Space Nine did touch on the seedy underbelly of Starfleet and the Federation. Lower Decks more focuses on, well, the little guys, the guys who live in the lower decks of the starships, the guys who make stuff actually happen, the guys who aren't always on the bridge. They aren't the main characters, although technically they are the main characters in this particular series, but they're not the ones making the big decisions, making the big shots, doing the flashy stuff, coming back from the dead, as it turns out, as an option in Star Trek. It's an interesting perspective. And it does have an interesting ship. called the Cerritos, because apparently all of the California class are named after towns and cities found in California. In fact, all of the California class ships' shuttlecraft are named after national parks. Honestly, as naming systems go, that's not too bad. I would point out that the classes typically are named after the first ship in the class. So having it being called the California class and then naming all the ships after towns in California technically violates that convention. But honestly, Starfleet's never been terribly great about naming ships to begin with, so we're just going to ignore that. Anyways, the California class are categorized as support ships. They're certainly not Galaxy class ships. They're not scientific ships. Technically, they fill in a lot of different roles. They can be engineering support. They can be medical support. They can be like diplomatic attaché support style ships. They do a whole pile of different things. And their general configuration is the classic Starfleet saucer with two pylons coming out of the bottom of it that each support a nacelle. The big difference between it and other similar single saucer, no secondary hull type ships is that kind of halfway down those nacelles, the warp nacelles in fact, are two more pylons that go inwards and do in fact support a very small secondary hull. This is a notable difference from the Miranda class or the Freedom class or even the Constellation class that actually had four nacelles. They didn't have a secondary hull. They just had the warp nacelles bolted onto the saucer section basically. Well, this guy's got that, plus a secondary hull supported between the two nacelles. This is where it gets weird, because that secondary hull between the two warp nacelles actually contains the main engineering for the entire ship. So it actually holds the primary warp core, the only warp core really, and all of the associated equipment like the antimatter storage systems, the intermix chamber, and specifically the deflector dish. In this case, amusingly, the Bussard ram scoops are actually in front of the deflector dish emitter. So maybe the scoops will actually be able to, scoop something, because we talked about that previously. But the weird part is that if you look at the Master Systems display for the California class, you do see that there is actually a turbo lift shaft that goes down through the arms. No, actually, this one does not have the Oberth problem of they tried to sneak some decks into those narrow pylons holding up the warp nacelles. Thank the great maker. But anyways, the turbo lift shaft goes through the pylon, along the length of the warp nacelle, and then finally deposits you in main engineering. How does that work when it's at warp? Like we talked about earlier, warp nacelles themselves are very heavily shielded because of all the crazy physics going on inside of them. It seems like running a turbo lift shaft inside of the nacelle is going to be a problem when there's all that crazy physics going on inside of them. And given that the turbolift shaft takes you to main engineering, it seems like you would have to get there while the ship was at warp. I'm seeing a problem. Now, maybe the turbolift shaft is in some kind of blister on the outside of the warp nacelle itself, so the shielding is wrapped around the nacelle, and then the turbolift shaft is kind of bolted onto it, so it's outside the shielding, but still inside of the skin of the ship, so it's not technically that big of a deal. Maybe. Except the other big deal with warp nacelles that kind of got overlooked over the years in Star Trek is that the nacelles have to be able to see each other. Now, what that has meant over the years has varied wildly, because in the original Star Trek, yes, the Constitution class, the Enterprise had, of course, the nacelles out on the stocks with absolutely nothing in between them and clear line of sight the entire length of the nacelle, stem to stern, good to go. Until we got to the Defiant class, where the nacelles were built into the ship. And yes, technically the bottom parts of the nacelles can see each other, but the rest of them are kind of built into the ship, so the ship's kind of in the way. This all was still the same basic problem of all the art, prop, whatever designers believing that the necessary physics to propel these ships at faster than light speeds would generate lots and lots of dangerous radiation or energy or something very hazardous for the crew's health. So they believe that the necessary field interaction between the two nacelles would create a very, very dangerous area between the two nacelles, and so nothing should go there. Except now we're putting main engineering right smack dab between the two nacelles. That makes sense. I mean, for heaven's sake, there's absolutely no reason for the Intrepid class to have nacelles that fold down, but whenever those types of ships tried to go into warp, they had to fold the nacelles up so the nacelles could see each other. And, well, technically the California class nacelles can see each other, but there's still main engineering kind of between the nacelles. It doesn't seem healthy for the occupants. Okay, fine. You've probably heard me say nacelle enough times, and I totally get what you're coming from. My larger point is that they could have had a similar main engineering system where it's kind of like not technically a full secondary hull, but it's not also not suspended between the two long cylindrical hard the things that I'm not allowed to say. They could have just put the main engineering between the two pylons that are holding up the warp doohickeys and kept it outside of the dangerous area between the two warp doohickeys. But they had to make it special because Cali classes are just weird. Although, I mean, honestly, they're kind of sort of not. It does have actually two dorsally mounted photon torpedo launchers. It does have ventral and dorsal phaser arrays, the weird strip style, not the turret style of the original series. It does actually have a shield array that's kind of shockingly good because it's automatically set up to basically rotate the shield around the ship so that the part of the shield is currently taking fire can be moved away from, taking fire, and other parts of the shield can take that fire to allow the damaged part of the shield to recover, which actually makes it surprisingly durable in combat until the shield repair system fails, and then it just kind of all falls apart. Like I said before, it's not actually a Galaxy class, but surprisingly, it has a lot of the amenities of a proper honest-to-God Galaxy class. It has a main shuttle bay in addition to two secondary shuttle bays. It has a pretty comprehensive holosuite. It has an amazingly large hydroponics bay. It has all the usual facilities that you might find on an average Starfleet ship. I think the big difference in the case of the California class versus the Galaxy class is that she doesn't have cubic miles worth of empty space. Because the big thing to remember about the Galaxy class is that she only has a crew of about 1,000 people, give or take. Except she's 642 meters long, 463 meters at the beam, and 195 meters tall. That's a lot of cubic meters. In fact, the Galaxy class, for evacuation purposes, can carry an additional 15,000 people. 15,000 on a ship. Now, that's just for evacuation purposes, so no, you can't have them on board for terribly long, but she was designed to carry probably another 1,000, 2,000 more people than she had crew on a regular basis for, diplomatic missions or support missions or exploratory missions. Well, the Cali class doesn't have that kind of space. She fits her crew in pretty snugly. But at the same time, she still has storage bays and med bays and science bays and all the usual stuff, just not volumes and volumes and volumes of space for diplomatic missions or stuff like that. She's a much more purpose-driven ship as opposed to just a go out there and see what's going on kind of ship, which kind of fits the role. Because amusingly, the Cali class was built specifically to be a second contact ship. Yes, I did say second contact. The Cali class's entire point of existence is to come in behind the Galaxy classes after the Galaxy classes have actually gone out and made first contact with alien species, and stop by and see how things are going, see how that first contact went, drop off any additional supplies or equipment or people the alien species might need, or try to fix whatever mess the Galaxy classes made. That was their whole raison d'etre. So no, they weren't going to be all big and flashy and expensive and huge. They were going to be functional and functional. Yeah. And honestly, it seems to do an okay job. I mean, of course, the series being animated and being deliberately comedic makes it out to be kind of like a kit bash monstrosity that works sometimes and doesn't work other times. But again, honestly, for non-mainstream ships, that's probably not wrong. I just wish they'd stop irradiating their engineers, that's all. And that's all from Sacred Cow Shipyards. Please be advised that any ship left on the docks for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Have a nice day.